On a quiet suburban street, one small family suddenly became the center of attention when the mischievous raccoon they once rescued started bringing home puppies from the neighbor's yard. The community was stunned. Was it theft? Or was there a heartbreaking secret waiting to be revealed? And when the truth came out, it left everyone speechless. The night Emily found the raccoon, the wind was worrying the fir trees like an old woman muttering to herself. A thin drizzle had started, turning the roadside dust to a skin of mud that clung to shoes and tires alike. Tom Miller had pulled his pickup onto the shoulder to tighten a loose strap on the lumber, and Emily, 10 years old, bundled in a purple raincoat, wandered a few steps down the ditch with a flashlight because she'd heard something that sounded like a cough. The beam slid over wet grass, a crushed soda can, then landed on 2 frightened eyes. He was no bigger than a cat, and shaking all over, one paw caught in a rusted box trap someone had left by the tree line. His fur was a patchwork of silver and cinnamon, slick with rain, and his ringed tail was trembling so hard the stripes seemed to vibrate. He made a sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a cry. Emily went still. The little animal went still too, as if both of them were deciding at the very same time whether to trust the other. "Dad," she called, voice steady in that brave way children sometimes have. "There's a raccoon. He's stuck." Tom climbed down, flashlight stuck under his arm, hands working at the trap. "Easy, buddy," he murmured. "We're not here to hurt you." The mechanism fought him like a bad habit, but after a moment the hinge gave, and the raccoon yanked his paw free, ready to bolt. Then he froze again, startled by Emily's raincoat brushing the grass. She didn't reach for him. She just crouched and let the flashlight sit warm and bright on the ground between them. "It's okay," she whispered, the way she whispered to butterflies that landed on the porch rail in summer. "You're okay now." He slipped into the shadow under the truck, and then, in a quiet decision that would puzzle Tom later, followed Emily to the passenger door like a guilty dog. They wrapped him in an old towel that lived behind the seat and drove the mile home with the heater on full blast. "He'll go back to the woods," Tom said, mostly to Linda when she met them at the door with that look of a wife who has learned to expect unplanned guests. "As soon as he warms up." They set him in a cardboard box by the wood stove with a plate of water and a little dish of leftover chicken. He ate with small, neat bites, eyes never leaving Emily's face. When the rain finally let up and the house settled into its nighttime clicks and sighs, the raccoon curled his ringed tail over his nose and slept. By morning he was gone. Tom found the window screen nudged just enough to make a story of it, and Emily stood on the porch in her socks, calling into the bright, washed air, "Bye, little guy. Be safe." She felt a pinch in her chest she couldn't name, the kind that stays with you when something fragile passes close to your life and then slips away. 2 nights later, Linda went to toss coffee grounds into the bin and nearly dropped the filter. A raccoon, quite possibly the raccoon, was sitting on the rim of the trash can like a sailor on a barrel, both hands deep in yesterday's supper. He looked up at her with the dignity of a diner caught before dessert. Linda laughed despite herself. "Well, aren't you somebody?" He didn't run. He stepped down, patted the lid closed with a little thump, and waddled off into the dark, with a leftover biscuit tucked like treasure against his chest. After that, visits happened often enough to become a rhythm. The Millers started seeing him at the edge of the yard just after sunset, where the porch light turned the grass into short blades of copper. He learned the sound of the back door and the scrape of the feed bucket, and would sit politely by the steps until Tom set out a saucer with whatever the day could spare, an apple core, a spoon of rice, a tiny wedge of cheddar that Emily insisted was for bravery. He'd wash each bite in the water bowl with careful fingers. "Like a gentleman," Linda said, though she made Tom bungee the lids of the cans after he discovered the clever latch trick the raccoon had perfected in 2 days. Emily named him Rusty because of the warm reddish shimmer that ran through his fur when the sun caught it. He showed up when the evenings smelled like cut grass, and again when they smelled like smoke and school starting, and the first hint of cold. He learned the path to the back steps and the exact distance he could stand from Tom without making the man's shoulders tense. He learned, too, that Emily could be trusted completely. She would sit cross-legged with a library book and read aloud softly, not stories about raccoons. She thought that would be rude, but stories about small, stubborn heroes finding their way home. Rusty had a gift for mischief that never felt mean. He'd pry the metal cap off the birdseed tin, take exactly 3 peanuts, and press the lid back on like a boy returning the cookie jar to its mark. He stole one gardening glove and left the other folded, as if suggesting a puzzle. Once he trotted off with a clothespin, only to return it an hour later by clipping it onto Tom's bootlace, while the man napped in a lawn chair. Another time he pushed the screen door open with both hands, peeked into the kitchen, and hiccuped so loudly Linda clapped a hand to her heart before laughing until she had to sit down. "You're trouble," she told him fondly, "but you're our trouble." On Saturdays, the neighborhood went about its rituals. The buzz of mowers, the thud of baskets on old backboards, the clink of ice in glasses on porches. Children played kickball along the cul-de-sac. Dogs announced the mail. Mr. Johnson across the fence organized his tools with the precision of a man who had once worn a badge. Mrs. Carter, 3 houses down, kept a quilt draped over the porch swing and a dish of peppermint drops on the little table beside it. Rusty moved through this small kingdom like a minor prince, invisible to most, tolerated by some, adored by one little girl who considered herself lucky beyond words. There were, of course, lines no one wanted crossed. Rusty tested each one, like a boy tapping the top rail of a fence to feel it sway. He figured out the latch on the shed and squeezed himself into the cool dark where the feed was kept. He learned the timing of the sprinklers and waited for the soft clack before racing through the arcs of water with his mouth open to catch the drops. He discovered that if he rocked the blue recycling bin just right, a can could be freed with a satisfying clatter. And if he took that can into the flower bed, Emily would follow and pretend to negotiate a trade. One shiny thing for another. They both thought they were winning. "Don't let him near the chicken coop," Tom warned once, more out of habit than fear. The neighbors' hens were kept behind decent wire, and Rusty had never shown much interest in feathers. Still, a man with lumber in his truck knows about the ways small things find their way into places they shouldn't. He installed a better latch on the gate and went to bed feeling he'd done something to keep the world squared up right. Late one evening in early summer, the sky the color of watermelon rind and streetlights just stuttering to life, Emily heard a sound that made her sit up in bed, a whimper, thin as thread. She went to the window, nose pressed to the screen, and listened again. It came, not from the woods or the ditch, but from somewhere closer, the far side of the fence that separated their yard from the Johnsons'. She cracked her window wider. The sound tugged at something in her that had tugged on the roadside months ago. By morning, the whimpering was gone, replaced by ordinary things. Sprinklers chattering, a radio from a truck in the alley, Linda's kettle squealing a little before the whistle. Emily ate her oatmeal, watched Rusty's shadow tip across the steps, and decided not to say anything. It was only a sound, after all, and the day was bright, and sometimes the world makes noises because it's alive. Rusty, though, had changed in a way only someone who paid careful attention would notice. He lingered at the border of the yard, eyes fixed not on the kitchen door where the cheese appeared, but on that far fence. He sat more often, his back a little hunched, his hands quiet on his knees. When Emily held out a cracker, he accepted it absently, turning his head to listen to something she couldn't hear. He seemed thinner, too, or maybe it was just the way the light fell through him, like water running shallow over stones. One afternoon, Tom came home dusty and tired, and found a small parade in the yard. Linda with a laundry basket on her hip, Emily barefoot in the grass, and Rusty standing on the porch rail like a tightrope walker, both hands out for balance. "Don't you dare," Linda said, not unkindly. Rusty leaned forward and plucked a clothespin from the line with the delicacy of a pianist, lifting a single note. He turned to Emily as if delivering a punchline, and dropped the clothespin into her open palm. She laughed in that free bell way Tom loved. The raccoon hopped down and scampered toward the steps, light on his feet. After supper, the family sat on the back stoop. Fireflies were starting up in the far lawn. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a baby cried and was comforted. Somewhere else, a dog barked. Then another answered, a chorus rising and falling until it softened into the ordinary hush of a street settling in. Rusty appeared at the edge of the shrubs, came close, and sat between Tom's boots like a good-luck statue. "You staying out of trouble tonight?" Tom asked, scratching just above the masked brow. Rusty closed his eyes and leaned into the touch for the space of a breath. Then he stood and looked again toward the fence, ears pricked, body taut with a purpose that had nothing to do with peanuts or clothespins or the game of stealing something small and returning it later. He slipped away without asking for a treat. Emily watched him go and felt that same unnameable pinch, a thread tugging at the hem of an ordinary evening. She didn't know, not yet, what business was blooming in the shadows next door. She only knew that the raccoon she'd rescued on a wet roadside had rescued something in her too, a certainty that small, brave acts matter. When Rusty reached the fence, he stopped, lifted his face to the wind and listened. For a moment, only a moment, he looked back toward the porch. Emily lifted her hand, palm up, the way people do at church when they offer and receive at the same time. "Good night, Rusty," she said softly. He slid through a gap between slats and vanished to the other side, where the grass smelled different and the night carried a thin, pleading sound the Millers couldn't hear from their stoop. The porch light hummed. The kettle clicked as it cooled. Somewhere, very close, new life was breathing small and shallow, and the raccoon moved toward it as if drawn by a memory older than his mischief, older than his name. The rain came in sheets that week, the kind that soaks through a jacket in the time it takes to cross a yard. It drummed on the tin roof over the woodpile and made the gutters talk to themselves. On Tuesday night, Rusty didn't come. Emily put a saucer out anyway, a hopeful habit, and watched it fill with water until the cheddar floated like a little raft. On Wednesday, there was only the hush of steady weather and a wet newspaper thumping onto porches up and down the block. On Thursday, even Tom admitted, quietly, that the woods had a way of calling their own back. When Rusty finally returned, he came at dawn, when the world is the color of pewter and even the birds sound sleepy. Emily saw him first from her bedroom window. He moved with care, as if the yard had turned to glass and might crack under him. His fur lay flat and dark, slicked to the bones, and there was mud dried like a necklace around one foreleg. He paused by the hydrangeas and shook himself just once, not the proud, showy shake of a dog, but a small, weary shrug. Then he sat on the bottom step, as if he'd been walking all night to find that very board. Emily slipped into her sweater and opened the back door on its soft hinge. Rusty didn't get up. He looked up at her, and she saw something different in those clever eyes. The usual sparkle was there, but it seemed to be shining through a thin veil, the way headlights look through fog. She set a fresh saucer down, and he washed each piece with slow, dutiful hands. When he finished, he rested his forepaws on her shoe, a brief, tentative wait. And then he went to the corner of the porch, curled there, and slept like a spent match. The storm moved east and left the air smelling green and raw. Life in the cul-de-sac picked itself up. Mr. Johnson dragged fallen branches to the curb, stacking them with the exactness of a man still fond of order. Mrs. Carter spread a blanket over her porch swing to dry and hummed something old and pretty. Linda took towels from the line, felt the damp, and hung them again with a sigh. Emily, after finishing her spelling list, settled on the top step with Rusty at her feet, reading the end of a book and pretending not to check every other minute that he was still there. That afternoon he rose and slipped through the slats in the fence with the steady purpose of someone who already knows the path. Emily followed at a distance, not wanting to spook him or earn a scold. She kept to the lilac bushes and the thin front edge of shadow along the fence. Rusty didn't head toward the dumpsters behind the bakery, where he sometimes found stale sugar and glory. He didn't nose around the compost for apple peels. He went to the far corner, where Johnson's yard met the backing lot of an empty rental house that had never quite found the right tenants. The grass there had grown long and lay matted from rain, and a battered plastic kiddie pool, half full of brown water and last year's leaves, sat tilting under the maple. That was where the sound lived, the faint thread Emily had heard nights ago, a peeping, not constant, but soft and stubborn, like a heart that refuses to stop. Rusty looked toward the sound and froze, the way he froze the first night in the ditch with his paw in the trap. He made no move to cross. He only sat, tail wrapped around his feet, and watched, listening like a man at a confessional booth. After a long while he rose, turned back the way he'd come, and returned to the porch. He climbed onto the second step this time, closer to the door, and placed his hands on the wood, as if feeling for a pulse in the house itself. That evening, Emily asked Linda, gentle as she could, about the empty place. "Did someone have puppies over there?" she said, almost whispering the last word, as if it might blow away. Linda shook her head. "I haven't seen anyone," she said, "but I heard Mr. Johnson telling the mailman his niece's lab just had a litter. That's 2 back, near the alley." She tapped the counter with her nail, thinking, "You know how puppies sound when Mama steps away. Maybe that's all you're hearing." It wasn't all Emily was hearing, and it wasn't all Rusty was hearing either. He stayed close to the yard in those days, but in a way that felt less like play and more like duty. He grew particular about the path he took from the shrubs to the steps, trotting, stopping, listening, trotting again. He ate what was offered, but he didn't ask for tricks or tug at the hems of anyone's patience. When Tom jiggled the key in the shed latch, Rusty didn't try to slip past him the way he always did. He sat and watched, solemn as a deacon. The first hint came 2 nights later, when the moon was a thin nail clipping caught in branches. Emily woke thirsty and went to the kitchen. She didn't turn on the light. The house was bright enough with that gentle moon glow and the street lamp wearing its halo at the corner. At the sink, she paused, cup in hand, because there was a shape on the porch that didn't belong to the usual list of night shapes. Rusty, yes, a little lump of him, the curve of his back. But another shape, low and trembling, pressed against his side. Emily stood very still. The shapes breathed together. One of them made that peeping sound, thin and insistent. Rusty slid his small hand over the other's head, a slow, grooming motion that looked too careful to be accidental. He didn't see her watching. After a minute, he eased himself away, leaving the trembling shape tucked into the shallow warmth his body had made, and he slipped through the fence again like water through a seam. In the morning, there was no sign of anything but the usual. A damp circle on the boards, maybe, where something small had slept. A smear of mud like a question mark near the step. Emily kept the knowledge folded in the pocket of her heart, the way some children keep a lucky penny. She didn't tell Tom, who might have said the right thing in the wrong tone, or Linda, who might have worried it into something it wasn't. Instead, she watched Rusty, and in watching, he told her what words wouldn't. On Sunday, the Millers drove to church on Oak Street, where Mrs. Carter sat 2 pews ahead, fanning herself with the bulletin, and Mr. Johnson nodded gravely during the hymn. Pastor Green preached on the small mercies that keep a town decent. Afterward, there were handshakes and coffee and a table of cookies with a dent where a little boy had tested the softness. Emily asked Mrs. Carter, very casually, whether raccoons ever helped other animals. The old woman smiled, sweet and shrewd. "Honey," she said, "I've seen tomcats raise barn kittens and a mutt take to a gosling like it was hatched from his own dreams. God's inventory of tenderness is larger than our filing cabinet." That line sat with Emily all day, soft and sturdy, like the best kind of blanket. That night she took it to the porch and held it in her mind like a lantern. Rusty arrived late, damp again, with burrs clinging to his tail. He looked thinner. When Emily tried to coax him to play their clothespin game, he sat down gently and rested one hand on her knee as if to say, "Not tonight." She stroked his head, the damp fur rough under her palm, and he closed his eyes for the space of 3 breaths. When he opened them, he rose and stared toward the fence, ears forward, everything about him answering a call that was older than tricks, older than the cleverness that could open latches and return stolen pins. The whimper came again, closer now, and with it a low, tired sound that might have been a mother talking to herself, because talking makes the hard parts easier. Emily felt something twist inside her. She thought of the week he'd been gone, the mud necklace around his foreleg, the way he slept like a spent match. She thought of water, rushing where it didn't belong, and small lives being carried where they couldn't hold on. She thought, though she didn't yet know, of nests made in a hurry and of milk that doesn't come when it should. The next day brought bright errands and the neighbors' chatter about a summer block party. Mr. Johnson put up a flyer on the telephone pole about keeping trash lids tight and pets inside after dark. "Coyotes," he said to no one in particular, though his eyes slid to the Miller yard and paused there long enough to make Linda feel the heat rise in her neck. Mrs. Carter left a jar of broth on Linda's step with a note in tidy script. "For whoever needs it, 2-legged or 4. Emily pretended to practice her spelling and instead drew a raccoon in the margin, small hands outstretched, not begging, but offering. That evening, the sky went purple at the edges, and the streetlights blinked on one by one like someone testing them. Rusty waited until the second blink, then the third, then he stood. He didn't look at the door for a treat. He didn't tap the empty saucer with the showman's patience that usually made Emily laugh. He slipped into the shadows and was gone long enough for the kettle to boil and be poured, and for Linda to tell Tom about the flyer, and for Tom to say something gentle about neighbors doing what neighbors do. When he returned, he wasn't alone. Emily heard him first, claws ticking the boards in a careful rhythm. She stepped to the door and put her hand on the knob, but didn't turn it. Through the glass she saw Rusty, and in his mouth, held with the same care he used to carry a cracker, a small black bundle that quivered and squeaked on every exhale. He set it down on the folded porch rug Emily sometimes used as a stage. He nudged it with his nose, then with a tiny push from his hand, and the bundle uncurled into a puppy no bigger than the heel of a loaf of bread. Rusty looked up, and for a heartbeat, the veil in his eyes lifted, and there was only purpose there, bright and steady. Emily's breath came out in a small, stunned cloud against the glass. The puppy made that peeping, not constant sound, and Rusty tucked himself around it, a comma around a word, neat and protective. He didn't look triumphant or guilty, or even particularly pleased with himself. He looked like a creature who had found the work he was meant to do, and had set about doing it. Emily didn't open the door. She knew without knowing how she knew that any clatter or flood of light would spoil something delicate, taking shape on the worn boards. She stood in the quiet kitchen and listened to the house breathe, and to the thin, stubborn sound outside. She thought of Pastor Green's sermon, and Mrs. Carter's jar, and the way Tom's big hand had been gentle on a rusted trap in a ditch months ago. She thought, with a certainty that made her throat ache, that the world had suddenly become heavier and more beautiful in the same hour. When Rusty finally lifted his head, he glanced once toward the fence, and then back at the puppy, as if weighing 2 clocks. He rose, padded to the step, and slipped through the slats into the other yard, where the grass still held the shape of a flood, and the night smelled of wet wood and worry. Emily leaned her forehead against the cool door window and whispered, though no one human heard her, "Be careful." In the dark of Johnson's side, something answered in the tiniest voice, and the raccoon moved toward it without hesitation, like a memory remembering itself. Saturday broke clean and bright, the sort of morning when laundry dries fast and men feel equal to lists. Tom was in the yard early, chalking a cut line on a 2x6 and humming the chorus of a song he only knew half of. The smell of sawdust lifted into the air and mixed with coffee and cut grass. Linda shook sheets over the clothesline until they billowed like sails. Emily sat on the porch step, reading, but not really reading, her eyes slipping to the fence whenever the page went quiet. Rusty appeared just after 9, trotting from the shrubs with a purpose that made Tom pause, chalk still between his fingers. The raccoon crossed the yard without a glance at the saucer by the step. He climbed the first stair, then the second, then stopped, head lifted toward the far fence. Emily saw the change in him, the way a sailor sees a change in wind. He was listening to the thin call that had threaded through the last nights, the one only he truly understood. Before anyone could speak, Rusty slipped down and threaded the gap between slats. Tom went back to his board, told himself it was nothing. But a minute later came a sound that didn't belong to a bright Saturday. A small cry, then the quick shuffle of something being carried. Tom set the chalk down and took 3 long steps to the fence. He saw it, plain as day. Rusty returned through the gap with a puppy in his mouth, black as a burnt marshmallow, paws dangling limply, but head trying to turn toward the light. The raccoon held the tiny body with an impossible tenderness, teeth set not to harm, but to cradle, the way a mother cat carries her young. For a heartbeat, Tom forgot to breathe. Then instinct rushed in, old and loud. He threw the gate latch back and stepped into the narrow space between houses. At that exact moment, Mrs. Johnson appeared on her side of the fence, clippers in one hand and a bucket of weeds in the other. She saw the raccoon and the puppy, and her mouth opened around a sound that started low and rose like a siren. "Thief!" she cried, the word tearing the quiet like a nail. "That raccoon is stealing our puppies." Tom lifted both hands, palms out, as if to calm a skittish horse. "Now hold on," he said, but the sheet on the line chose that instant to snap and crack like a flag, and the noise set the tiny dog squeaking in Rusty's grip. The raccoon flinched and darted for the Miller yard. He ran past Tom's boots, across the grass, straight to the old garden shed by the lilacs. Tom followed, pulse in his throat, not sure whether to stop him or protect him. The shed door stuck the way it always did, until Rusty put both small hands on the frame and shouldered into the gap. He slipped inside with the puppy and disappeared into the cool, sweet dark that smelled of soil, twine, and last year's tomatoes. Tom reached the door and peered through the diamond of shadow. In the back corner, where an old crate lay on its side, Rusty crouched and set the puppy into a nest of burlap he'd dragged together, a low circle that looked for all the world like it had been waiting. "Tom!" Linda called from the porch, voice tight. "What is he doing?" Emily stood beside her, book dangling at her knee. She felt a slow ache open under her ribs. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. She knew, as surely as she knew the sound of the front door hinge, that Rusty was not doing harm. But she could feel the neighborhood turning toward them like a flock of birds banking on a wind. Mrs. Johnson's cry had done its work. Mr. Rodriguez from the bakery stuck his head over his back gate. The Thompsons paused with their stroller halfway down the sidewalk. Someone's teen shouted, "Yo, check it out!" And a second later, there were 3 teens. A dog at the far corner began to bark, and then every dog joined until the cul-de-sac felt full of alarms. Tom stepped into the shed. The eyes adjusting dimness pressed cool against his cheeks. He saw the crate, the burlap, the small round of Rusty's back, as the raccoon curled his body around the puppy and began to lick the damp fur with careful strokes. The pup's squeaks softened to a steady peep, like a kitchen timer left on low. Rusty lifted his head once and met Tom's gaze. There was nothing wild in that look, nothing soft either. It was workmanlike, as if he were asking the man to hand him the right wrench and not argue about it. "Tom Miller," Mrs. Johnson shouted from the yard. "You get that animal away from my dogs." The clippers clacked in her fist. Her husband wasn't home, but her voice made up for his absence. "I'm calling animal control." Linda's hand found Emily's shoulder and squeezed. "Inside," she said, but Emily didn't move. Her eyes were on Rusty. She saw his sides move, slow and steady, saw his small hands shift to cup the puppy's head just so, the way you hold a newborn when the neck is not yet ready for the world. She thought of the damp circle on the porch last night and the smudge of mud like a question mark. She thought of the way Rusty had slept, like a spent match on the step. The feelings braided together into one sharp thread. He was mothering. Tom knelt. "Easy, buddy," he said, his voice the same voice he'd used on the trap the night they found Rusty by the road. He held one hand out, not touching, just offering his size and his patience. Rusty didn't hiss. He didn't back away. He lowered his head and continued his work. The small, rhythmic grooming that calms tiny hearts and warms cold blood. The puppy's peeping settled into silence. Not frightened silence, but the quiet of a full belly after a bottle, though there had been no bottle. "Tom," Linda said again, and when he turned, he saw the thing he had hoped wouldn't happen. Mrs. Johnson had her phone out, and her jaw was set in that particular way that means the decision's already been made. Behind her, Mr. Johnson's truck turned the corner. He climbed out slow, taking in the clump of neighbors, the wild angle of Linda's sheets, the sightline from his fence to the Miller shed. He had the stance of a man who still counted things and put them in columns. Right, wrong, mine, someone else's. "What's this?" he asked, voice flat. "Your raccoon is stealing our puppies," his wife said, each word checked and boxed. Mr. Johnson's eyes narrowed. He looked at the gap in the fence, then at the shed door, then at Tom. The old habit of command made his shoulders square. "Open up," he said, not unkindly, but with the assumption that people would do as asked. "Let me see what's what." Tom hesitated. He wasn't sure who he was defending. His neighbor's rights? His daughter's heart? The raccoon who had learned to close the trash can lid after himself? He put his hand on the door. It stuck, then yielded, and the day poured into the dim, flattening the shadows. Mr. Johnson stepped inside and stopped. There in the back corner was the small scene no one expected to see. A raccoon curled around a newborn pup, tiny chest beating like a moth's wing, both of them held in the ordinary holiness of warmth and breath. Something in the man's face softened at the edges, then hardened again, quick as a flinch. "That's mine," he said, and his voice did a little breaking he probably didn't hear. "One of Daisy's." "He didn't hurt it," Emily said, the words out before she could think to be quiet. "He brought it here. He's keeping it warm." Mr. Johnson looked at the girl, then at Tom, then back at Rusty. He wasn't a cruel man. He was a man trained to expect the worst and be grateful when he was wrong. "Even so," he said, but the force had leaked from the words. Behind him, Mrs. Carter's cane clicked on the walk. She stood in the doorway and took in the scene with a nurse's eye. "That pup's been out in the wet," she said softly. "It's chilled." "That little fella's doing what he can." She nodded at Rusty. "Lord knows I've seen stranger kindness." There was a long breath where the shed seemed to hold everyone in one bowl. Neighbors, raccoon, puppy, worry, love. Outside, the dog's chorus died back to a few half-hearted barks. The teens drifted off, disappointed the show hadn't ended with sirens. The sheets snapped lazily. Linda's grip on Emily's shoulder eased. Mrs. Johnson cleared her throat, reminded of her position as chief of order on their strip of street. "We need those pups back," she said, but it came out soft. Daisy's beside herself. "He'll bring it when it's warm," Emily said. And for a second, everyone looked at this small person as if she had earned the right to speak by telling a truth no one else had found yet. "He'll bring it," she repeated, because she believed it in that bell-clear way childhood sometimes hands to the brave. Rusty lifted his head at the sound of her voice. He glanced from the girl to the man to the open door, judging the distance, measuring the noise. Then he bent, and with that same impossible gentleness, took the puppy again and stood. He moved past the men, belly low, steps precise, and slipped out into the bright yard, as if the sunlight were a thing that could startle what he carried. Mr. Johnson and Tom followed, slow, as if any hurry might shake loose the fragile understanding that had settled among them. At the fence, Rusty paused. He looked back once, not at the men or the crowd, but at Emily on the porch, her hand lifted the way she lifted it the night before at the window. Then he vanished through the gap. On the other side, there was the quick thump of small feet. A woman's breath caught in her throat, and then the tremulous relief of a puppy's cry rising into the clean morning. The yard exhaled. Voices started again, casual and brave. Someone made a joke about raccoon daycare, and a few neighbors laughed because they needed to. But under the chatter ran a new current, thin and electric. It said that something had shifted on their street, something that would not be put neatly back. Tom looked at the gap in the fence and felt the weight of it, heavier than a gate, lighter than a grudge. Rusty would be back. Tom knew it as surely as he knew the measure of a board by the sound it made when he tapped it. And when the raccoon came again, there would be eyes on him and voices ready, and the line between theft and rescue would be argued on lawns and porches, and under the gentle authority of a woman with a cane who had seen stranger kindness. Sunday supper at the miller's table was quieter than usual. The roast chicken sat carved on its platter, potatoes steaming, corn buttered in a bowl, but forks moved slowly, as if everyone were listening past each other. Tom chewed with the steady rhythm of a man who needed to think before he spoke. Linda's napkin twisted in her lap. Emily poked at her corn, eyes drifting toward the window every few minutes, waiting for a shadow with ringed tail to appear. Rusty did not come that evening, and the absence was a weight heavier than the food on their plates. Outside, the neighborhood felt watchful. Porch lights came on early. Curtains twitched. The cry of a baby 2 doors down carried through the air, followed by the hush of a mother's lullaby. When Emily asked if she could leave scraps on the step, Linda hesitated, then nodded, though her lips pressed tight. "Only small ones," she said, "and don't stand out there long." By Monday morning, the whispers had turned into full voices. At the Johnsons' Daisy, the Labrador paced her yard, whining at the fence. Mr. Johnson stood with his arms folded, surveying his property as though it were a crime scene. "That raccoon's got a taste for pups," he muttered to anyone within earshot. "And if the Millers don't handle it, I'll make sure animal control does." His words carried down the street like laundry flapping on a windy day. On the opposite porch, Mrs. Carter sat, wrapped in her shawl. Kane leaned against her chair, watching with eyes that had seen more winters than most. She didn't shout, didn't argue. Instead, she called Emily over when the girl passed with her backpack. "Don't you fret, honey," she said in her low, soothing voice. "Animals got more sense of duty than folks give 'em credit for. That little fellow of yours, he's not stealing. He's answering a call." She pressed a peppermint drop into Emily's hand, as if it were a charm to ward off worry. But the neighborhood was not so easily charmed. By Tuesday, flyers appeared on telephone poles. "Protect our pets. Keep wildlife away." Someone taped one to the miller's mailbox. Tom pulled it down before Linda saw, but Emily had already read the bold letters. "They're talking about Rusty," she whispered, her throat tightening. Tom folded the paper, stuffed it into his back pocket, and said nothing. That night, the Miller house felt like a boat, braced against waves. Tom sat long on the porch, hammer still in hand from mending the shed door. Linda washed dishes with more force than needed, each plate clattering as if it had committed a sin. Emily pretended to do her homework, but her pencil marks wandered. When the porch light drew a soft circle on the grass, Rusty emerged from the shadows. He climbed the steps, paused at the saucer, then turned his face to the fence with that same pulled string in his body. Emily's heart beat so fast she thought the whole street might hear it. Across the way, a new figure had joined the watchers. Teenagers, restless with summer nights, lounged near the Johnsons' drive. Phones glowed in their hands, ready to capture anything that looked like trouble. "There he is," one boy whispered, loud enough for it to carry. "The puppy thief." The word stung, sharp as a stone thrown against glass. Rusty slipped back through the gap, vanishing into the Johnson yard. A hush fell. Minutes stretched, the kind that feel longer than hours. Then he returned, carrying another tiny pup in his mouth. This one was brown, speckled with white, eyes still sealed shut. The teens gasped, phones lifted, flashes firing. Daisy barked furiously on the other side, and Mrs. Johnson's voice rose from her porch. "Tom Miller, that beast is robbing us blind!" Emily rushed forward, but Tom's hand caught her shoulder. "Stay put," he said, though his own jaw was tight as rope. Rusty padded across the yard, calm as a man carrying a loaf of bread. He set the puppy in the burlap nest inside the shed, then curled around it with quiet devotion. By now, half the block had gathered. Mr. Rodriguez from the bakery leaned on his gate, eyebrows raised. "You folks ever see anything like it? A raccoon raising dogs? That's a miracle if you ask me." His words were almost cheerful, but Mrs. Johnson snapped back. "It's theft, plain and simple. That animal's dangerous." Her husband stood behind her, phone in hand, debating whether to make the call he'd promised. The crowd hummed with divided voices. Some murmured awe, others suspicion. Children tugged their parents' sleeves, begging to see the pups. One boy whispered that Rusty was like a hero from the comics, saving babies no one else would. A woman shook her head, muttering about rabies and disease. Inside the shed, Rusty licked the pup's fur, the sound steady, patient, a heartbeat against the storm of opinion outside. Emily pressed her forehead to the doorframe, torn between pride and fear. She wanted to shout the truth, that Rusty had lost his own family, that he was only trying to fill the hollow left behind, but the words sat heavy in her chest. That evening, arguments spilled into kitchens and porches. At the Johnson table, Mrs. Johnson circled numbers on the calendar, saying they couldn't lose more pups. At the Rodriguez bakery, customers swapped theories between bites of fresh bread. In the Miller home, silence hung like a damp cloth. Finally, Tom spoke. "It's coming to a head," he said, voice low. "Folks won't stand for much more." Linda shook her head. "And what do you expect us to do?" "Hand him over. That raccoon saved Emily's heart as much as those pups." Emily, listening at the table, whispered what she believed. "Rusty isn't stealing. He's saving them." Her parents looked at her, and in the dim light of the dining room, no one argued. But outside, the divide deepened. Neighbors chose sides: protect the pups by force, or trust the strange kindness of a wild creature. And Rusty, unaware of the storm he had stirred, slipped once more through the fence before dawn, chasing the small cries only he could not ignore. The week stretched long, each evening stitched with tension like a quilt pulled too tight. The Miller house carried the weight of eyes from every porch on the street. Linda kept the curtains drawn after supper, and Tom added a padlock to the shed door, though he never used it. Emily tiptoed through her days, waiting for the moment she knew would come, the sound of claws on wood, the small cry of life carried across a fence. On Wednesday night, the air was heavy with July heat. Windows stood open, letting in the drone of crickets and the hum of distant traffic. Emily sat at her desk pretending to color, but really listening. At 9, the noise came, the faint scrape of boards, followed by that unmistakable squeak. She ran to the window, careful not to startle the scene below. Rusty was there, slipping from shadow to shadow, carrying another puppy. This one was spotted like spilled ink, legs kicking weakly, mouth open in a sound too small for anyone but the raccoon to hear. He crossed the yard as though the grass itself might betray him. Behind him, Daisy's bark rose, frantic and hoarse. Lights snapped on in the Johnson house. A man's voice cursed. Rusty vanished into the shed with his tiny burden just as a door slammed and footsteps hit the pavement. Emily held her breath, clutching the window frame so tightly her knuckles burned. The next morning, the neighborhood was alive with rumor. Some swore they had seen the raccoon dragging puppies to the Miller yard. Others claimed the Millers were hoarding them, refusing to give them back. Mrs. Johnson marched to the bakery and told anyone who would listen that she would not have her family's pets stolen in plain sight. Mr. Rodriguez tried to argue, but she silenced him with a glare sharp enough to slice. By noon, a group had gathered at the corner, their voices rising and falling in heated tones. Some wanted Rusty gone, others whispered that it was remarkable, almost holy, what he was doing. A boy on a bike rode laps, chanting "puppy thief" like it was a playground taunt. Each word landed on Emily's shoulders like a stone. That evening, Emily decided she could no longer stand by. When the house grew quiet, she slipped out with her flashlight. She knew Rusty's path now, the way he slunk along the lilacs, the pause before the fence. She crouched low and followed. The air was thick with the smell of wet leaves and soil. Her heart pounded so hard she feared Rusty would hear it. Through the gap, she saw him crouched in the Johnson yard. The shed at the back leaned on one side, half swallowed by weeds. From inside came the soft whimper of more pups, weak and desperate. Rusty slipped inside, and Emily crept after, keeping her light low. What she saw made her knees go weak. The shed floor was littered with rags and broken boxes. In the far corner lay a bundle of puppies, too many to count in the dim light, their cries thin as paper. Beside them, chained to a post, was Daisy, ribs showing, sides heaving with the effort of breath. Her eyes were dull, her milk gone. She licked weakly at the closest pup, then dropped her head with a sigh. Emily's throat closed. No one had told her Daisy was sick. No one had said the puppies were starving. Rusty moved among them with purpose. He lifted one pup gently, carried it toward the gap, then returned for another. Each trip was measured, steady, as if he knew he could not save them all at once. Emily wanted to cry out, to help, but she stayed silent, sensing that the fragile trust between Raccoon and mother dog might shatter if she stepped wrong. When Rusty finished, 3 pups were gone, carried into the night. Daisy gave a low whine, and for a moment, Rusty pressed his nose to hers. The gesture was brief, almost reverent. Then he turned and slipped back into the dark. Emily followed him as far as the miller's shed. Inside, she found the burlap nest, full now, with tiny bodies, their squeaks blending into one chorus of need. Rusty curled around them, tail draped like a blanket. He licked each face in turn, patient and tireless. The sight was so tender, it made Emily's eyes sting. She sank to her knees just outside the door and whispered, "You're not stealing. You're saving them." But the neighborhood saw only the part they wanted. By Friday, whispers had grown teeth. Mrs. Johnson called animal control again. Teenagers gathered near the Miller fence, daring each other to catch the raccoon on video. Even Mr. Rodriguez, once so supportive, shook his head with worry. "They'll never understand," he told Tom at the bakery. "They'll see theft before they see mercy." That night, Emily told her parents what she had seen. The sick mother dog, the starving pups, the way Rusty tended to them like his own. Her words tumbled out in a rush, desperate for belief. Tom rubbed his chin, eyes heavy with thought. Linda pressed her lips together, torn between fear and compassion. "If what you say is true," Tom murmured, "then Rusty's the only thing standing between those pups and the grave." Emily nodded fiercely. "And if we let them take him, they'll all die." The house fell into silence again, but this time it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of a decision settling in, heavy as stone. Outside, the night stirred with movement. Rusty was already gone, back through the fence, back to the shed where cries still rose, stubborn and thin. Emily stood at the window, peppermint drops still sweet on her tongue from Mrs. Carter's pocket. She pressed her hand to the glass, a promise unspoken. She would find a way to make them all see. She would defend Rusty, no matter the cost. Saturday dawned sharp and clear. the kind of morning that made the paint on porches look whiter and the sky bluer than memory allowed. But the brightness only made the tension on Maple Street more obvious. Conversation stopped when the Millers walked by. Mrs. Johnson's curtains twitched every time a shadow crossed the Miller yard, and by mid-morning, a group of neighbors had gathered in small knots along the sidewalk, voices clipped and sharp, like bees buzzing too close to the hive. Inside the Miller house, the strain was beginning to split the seams. Linda scrubbed the counter as though she meant to erase the wood beneath. Tom sat at the table, boots tapping, staring at the phone as if it might ring with judgment. Emily perched on the bottom step of the porch, her book unopened in her lap, listening for the sound she both dreaded and longed to hear, the quick tick of claws on wood. By noon, the sound came. Rusty appeared from the hedge, his fur darker with sweat and dust, eyes set with a kind of solemn purpose. This time, though, he didn't come empty. In his mouth was another puppy, smaller than the others, its fur a deep chocolate, paws tucked close to its chest. The pup whimpered once, and that single sound carried across the yard like a bell. Emily leapt to her feet, joy and fear colliding in her chest. But before Rusty could slip into the shed, a shout cut the air. "There! Caught him again!" It was Mr. Johnson, striding across his yard, phone already out. His wife followed close, her face tight with fury. Behind them came two teenagers with phones raised high, recording every step. "This time, Tom," Mr. Johnson called. "We're done watching." "We're calling animal control." The words struck like a hammer. Linda froze in the doorway, dish towel twisted in her hands. Tom stood, jaw clenched, and stepped into the yard. "Now hold on, Bill," he said, voice measured. "He hasn't hurt them. You've seen with your own eyes." "Haven't hurt them?" Mrs. Johnson snapped. "He's dragged half our litter across that fence. You can't tell me that's safe. You can't tell me that's right." Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the rising voices. Some stood with arms crossed, faces set with suspicion. Others shifted uneasily, remembering the sight of Rusty curled around the pups. Mrs. Carter hobbled up with her cane, her sharp eyes taking in the scene, but she didn't speak, not yet. Rusty, unaware or uncaring of the storm, padded to the shed and laid the chocolate pup in the burlap nest beside its siblings. He curled his body protectively around them, tail sweeping like a blanket, and began his patient grooming. The tiny cries quieted, settling into the rhythm of breath and warmth. The sight was so tender, it made Emily's throat ache. But the crowd outside the shed saw something else, a wild animal with its teeth near babies that weren't its own. Fear, once lit, spread quick. Voices rose. "Call them now," someone shouted. "That's not natural." "Next thing you know, it'll turn on the kids." Tom raised his hands, his voice loud enough to carry. "Folks, listen. That raccoon isn't harming those pups. He's keeping them alive. My daughter's seen it. I've seen it. We all have." But the tide was against him. Mr. Johnson's thumb hovered over the screen of his phone, ready to dial. "Tom, you can't keep defending this. It's not safe. My Daisy's sick, and now half her litter's gone. This ends today." The words cracked something inside Emily. She stepped forward, small but fierce, her voice trembling but clear. "He's not stealing. He's saving them. Daisy can't take care of them. She's too sick, I saw it." She turned, eyes wide, pleading with the crowd. "He goes in at night. He brings them back one at a time. If he didn't, they'd die. Please, you have to believe me." For a heartbeat, silence fell. Even the dogs seemed to hold their breath. Then, just as the moment hung fragile as glass, flashing lights cut down the street. A white truck with the seal of animal control pulled to the curb. A man in uniform stepped out, clipboard in one hand, net pole in the other. The crowd shifted, some relieved, others uneasy. Emily's stomach dropped. Rusty, still curled in the shed, lifted his head at the change in noise. He blinked at the man, then at the crowd, ears twitching. The chocolate pup whimpered, and he lowered his head to soothe it. The officer stepped forward. "We've had reports," he said, his voice carrying the weight of practiced authority. "A raccoon interfering with domestic animals. We're here to remove it before harm's done." "No," Emily cried, stepping in front of the shed door. "You don't understand. He's the only reason they're still alive." Tom put a steadying hand on her shoulder, but didn't move her aside. His eyes met the officer's. "You'll want to hear the whole story before you take him," he said quietly. The crowd pressed closer, torn between fear and curiosity. Mrs. Johnson's arms folded tight across her chest, but her eyes flickered with something less certain. Mrs. Carter leaned heavier on her cane, then finally spoke, her voice clear despite the years. "Before you haul him off, maybe you ought to see where he's been bringing them from." A ripple moved through the crowd. Hesitation, the smallest crack in the wall of suspicion. The officer paused, studying the girl standing firm before the shed. The raccoon crouched protectively inside, and the divided faces of a neighborhood at war with itself. Rusty licked the chocolate pup's fur, his eyes catching the light just long enough to show something that looked almost human, purpose, devotion, and a grief too deep for words. The standoff hung, fragile and taut, as if the whole street were holding its breath for what came next. The officer stood still, one hand on the net pole, the other resting on his clipboard, eyes narrowing at the scene in front of him. The neighborhood had gathered close, some leaning over fences, others whispering behind their palms. Rusty curled protectively around the pups in the shed, blinked at the man with slow patience. Emily stayed planted in front of the doorway, her small shoulders squared in a way that reminded Tom of his late father standing guard at the edge of a cornfield during a storm. "Step aside, miss," the officer said. His voice wasn't unkind, but it carried the weight of someone who had repeated the same line 100 times. "Wild animals don't belong in homes, and this one has crossed the line." "No," Emily answered, her voice cracking but firm. "He's not dangerous. He's saving them." The crowd shifted uneasily. Mrs. Johnson folded her arms, eyes hard. "Saving them? By dragging them across the fence like contraband? Don't be ridiculous. That raccoon's nothing but a thief." "He's no thief," came another voice, older, steadier. Mrs. Carter stepped forward, cane tapping the ground like punctuation. "You people are blind with fear. I've seen the way he keeps them warm, feeds them the best he can. That's no thief's work." The officer glanced from one to the other, clearly unsettled. "And where exactly are these puppies coming from?" he asked. Emily took a deep breath, her courage rising from somewhere she didn't know she had. "I can show you," she said. The silence that followed was thick enough to hear the crickets chirping from the hedges. Tom placed a steady hand on her back. "If there's more to this, let's see it," he said, his voice heavy with a father's gamble. The officer gave a slow nod. "All right, lead the way." Emily guided them toward the gap in the fence, her flashlight clutched like a sword. Rusty followed at a distance, as if understanding this was his trial, his moment of proof. The crowd trailed behind, murmuring like a congregation unsure of its hymn. The Johnsons' backyard stretched wide and neat, every blade of grass trimmed to military precision. But at the far end, where the yard gave way to the abandoned rental lot, the picture changed. Weeds tangled waist-high, An old shed leaned like a drunk against the fence, its door half open. From inside came a sound. Soft, desperate whimpers that pricked the air like needles. Emily went first. She pushed the door wider, and the smell hit them. Damp straw, mildew, and the sharp tang of sickness. Inside, the flashlight beam caught a heartbreaking sight. A cluster of puppies huddled in the corner, ribs sharp beneath their fur, voices thin as paper. Beside them lay Daisy, the Labrador, chained to a post, sides heaving. Her eyes fluttered open at the light, dull with exhaustion. She tried to lift her head, but it fell back onto the straw. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Even Mrs. Johnson covered her mouth. "She's sick," Emily said softly. "Too sick to care for them. Rusty's been carrying them out one by one so they wouldn't die here." The officer stepped forward, crouched beside Daisy and laid a hand gently on her ribs. He frowned. "She's malnourished, dehydrated. This dog should have been under care weeks ago." He turned his gaze to the Johnsons, but said nothing more. The silence was enough. Rusty padded past everyone, straight to the corner where the weakest pup whimpered. He nosed it gently, lifted it into his mouth, and carried it toward the door. No one moved to stop him, not even the officer. They all watched as he crossed the yard with the fragile cargo, tail lifted like a flag of determination. Mr. Rodriguez's voice broke the silence. "Well, I'll be damned. That raccoon's been doing what none of us thought to do." Some nodded, others muttered, but the tide had shifted. The suspicion that had clung like smoke began to thin. Even Mr. Johnson's jaw slackened as he stared at Daisy. He looked older, suddenly, more tired than angry. Back at the Miller shed, Rusty laid the weak pup beside its siblings. He curled his body around the nest, tail sweeping protectively, and began to lick each tiny face. The officer watched in silence, his net pole forgotten against the fence. Finally, he straightened, clearing his throat. "This is unusual," he admitted. "I've seen plenty of raccoons cause trouble, but I've never seen one do this. He's not your problem. He's part of the solution." He looked at the Johnsons again. "We'll get Daisy treated, free of charge. As for the pups, let's let the raccoon keep doing what he's been doing until she's strong enough." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back. She only nodded, relief flooding her chest. The crowd began to break apart, whispering to each other, softer now. The teenagers tucked their phones away, uncertain of what story they'd captured. Mrs. Carter leaned on her cane and gave Emily the smallest of smiles. "Didn't I tell you, honey? God's inventory of tenderness is bigger than we think." As the sun slipped low, painting the sky in amber and violet, Rusty rested in the shed, pups pressed against his fur. For the first time in weeks, the Miller house felt still, safe. But Emily knew it wasn't the end. She knew this was only the beginning of the story. Rusty's story, Daisy's story, the pup's story. And for the first time, the neighborhood seemed ready to listen. The days that followed felt like a season changing, though the calendar said July. The sharp suspicion that once clung to every corner of Maple Street began to soften, replaced by a hum of curiosity, even pride. The story of the raccoon and the puppies spread first from porch to porch, then into town, carried in whispers through the bakery and into the pews of Oak Street Church. By midweek, it had found its way into the local paper. The headline read, "Raccoon raises puppies while mother dog recovers." Rusty, of course, didn't know any of that. He only knew the rhythm of his days, slipping through the fence, checking on Daisy in the abandoned shed, then returning to the miller's yard where the burlap nest now overflowed with squirming life. His tail curled protectively around the pups, his small hands fussing over them like an old nurse with a flock of orphans. Emily never tired of watching. She'd sit on the step in the evening light, peppermint drop melting on her tongue, reading aloud from her books as Rusty kept the pups quiet with his steady grooming. Sometimes the little dogs would tumble against him in clumsy play, batting at his tail or nipping his ear. He'd tolerate it with patience, then give them a playful shove of his own, leaving Emily laughing so hard she had to wipe her eyes. But it wasn't only Emily who noticed. Neighbors began to trickle over, one by one, drawn by curiosity stronger than their fear. Mr. Rodriguez brought warm bread for the Millers, insisting that a hero, raccoon or not, deserved a proper feast. The Thompson children pressed their noses to the fence, whispering in awe at the sight of the unlikely family. Even Mrs. Johnson came once, standing stiff as a post while Rusty curled around the pups. She didn't speak, but when Daisy's bark echoed faintly from across the yard, her eyes filled with tears, she quickly wiped away. Daisy herself was slowly recovering. With the vet's help and the steady hand of Mrs. Carter, she regained strength each day. Her ribs began to vanish under new weight. Her eyes brightened. Her tail wagged weakly when children came near. But her milk had not yet returned, and so Rusty remained the lifeline of her litter. One evening, as the sky turned pink over the rooftops, the officer returned, not with net pole, but with a camera. "The town council wants to know the truth for themselves," he explained, snapping photos of Rusty as the raccoon nosed each pup with practiced care. The flashes startled him at first, but Emily whispered softly, and he returned to his work, unconcerned. Soon, the story spread beyond their little town. A local TV crew came, their van parked awkwardly at the curb, cameras perched like curious birds. They filmed Rusty tending his pups, filmed Emily's shy smile as she explained how he'd saved them, filmed Daisy resting in the shade, her eyes calm at last. When the segment aired, strangers from other counties drove past Maple Street, craning for a glimpse of the miracle raccoon. Charm, the Millers could have turned it into a spectacle, but they didn't. Tom kept the shed door open, welcoming those who wanted to look, but never allowing anyone to disturb the nest. Linda baked pies for the visitors, shaking her head in wonder at the way fate had chosen their backyard for such a story. And Emily, well, she only sat beside Rusty, whispering her gratitude into his fur, where no one else could hear. The turning point came the day Daisy was well enough to cross the yard on her own. It was late afternoon, cicadas buzzing, the smell of cut grass heavy in the air. Rusty was curled around the pups when Daisy padded slowly through the gap in the fence. The street fell silent. Neighbors held their breath, expecting a fight, a reclaiming, some clash of instinct. But Daisy only lowered her head and sniffed at the nearest pup. The little dog squeaked and stumbled toward her, pressing against her chest. Daisy whined, a soft sound of recognition. The rest of the litter followed, tails wagging clumsily. Rusty lifted his head, eyes on Daisy. For a moment, no one moved. Then, with a kind of grace that felt older than the world itself, he stepped back, leaving space for her to gather her family. The pups crowded against their mother, yipping and climbing over her legs. Daisy licked each one, her tail thumping weakly in joy. The neighbors broke into tears and applause at the same time. Emily pressed her hands to her mouth, overwhelmed. Rusty, ever steady, simply circled around them, lying nearby, a guardian at ease. From that day forward, Daisy and Rusty shared the work. She fed them when she could, and he kept them warm, clean, and playful. The sight of a Labrador mother and a raccoon father raising pups together became the kind of story people told to lift their hearts when the world felt heavy. Weeks passed, and the pups grew strong. They stumbled less, barked louder, chewed on everything in reach. When they tumbled into Rusty's fur, he rolled with them, patient and sly, sometimes darting away just to let them chase him, tails wagging like flags. The neighborhood children cheered, calling him the puppy guardian. Even Mrs. Johnson, still stiff in her pride, couldn't help but smile when she saw them. By summer's end, the pups were ready for new homes. Families from across town came to adopt them, each pup carried out from the shed with careful hands. Emily cried when the first left, but Rusty only watched, calm, as though he understood his work was nearly done. Daisy stayed close, tail wagging slow, trusting the people now that she was no longer alone. On the last night, when only one pup remained, Emily sat on the porch with Rusty curled beside her. The air was cool, stars sharp against the velvet sky. She stroked his fur and whispered, "You've given them a family, and me too. You'll always be ours." Rusty licked her hand once, then turned his gaze toward the fence, ears pricked to the night sounds only he could hear. The pup was taken the next morning, carried off in loving arms. Daisy went with Mrs. Johnson, healed and proud again, her leash shining in the sun. Rusty lingered near the steps, eyes following them until they disappeared down the street. Then he slipped into the shadows, not vanishing, but choosing his place. Still part of the Miller family, still the guardian of Maple Street, but free. That evening, the Millers sat on their porch, the neighborhood calm at last. Tom smoked his pipe, Linda folded her quilt, and Emily leaned against the railing, eyes on the hedge. She didn't call out. She didn't need to. She knew he was there, watching, waiting, her mischievous, tender raccoon who had turned suspicion into wonder and loneliness into love. And as the fireflies rose and the street settled into its quiet heartbeat, it seemed that Maple Street itself had learned Rusty's lesson, that even the most unlikely guardian can change the world, one fragile life at a time. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments so we know you're with us. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because the next story is already on its way, and you won't want to miss it.